Hello, everyone. This is Ashley Finley, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. Hopefully, you can hear me all right as we go through this. Just a quick reminder: if you don't have your line muted already, to please go ahead and do that so we can make sure that we can reduce the noise in the background. So thanks so much to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules and days to join us for this. If you don't know me, and I know I've scrolled through the attendees, there's lots of people that I don't know on the list, which is wonderful. I'm Ashley Finley. I'm the National Evaluator for the Bringing Theory to Practice project, also Senior Director of Assessment and Research at AAC&U. And before we formally get started here, let me just go over a few technical tips that will help everything run smoothly. I'm joined in the BTtoP office in Washington D.C. by a handful of colleagues over here at the Bringing Theory to Practice project, and so we have people that are helping us with resolve technology issues and so forth. So if you're having trouble or hearing anything with the presentation, please use the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen to send a message to any of us directly. Goldie Pica is actually managing most of the tech issues, so you can send a message directly to her if anything gets crazy. We do want to let you know that the presentation is being recorded. So again, to cut down on any of the ambient noise that we have, please be sure to press *6 on your phone line, and that will actually mute your line. So and we are definitely getting some background noise. So if you haven't done that, I would encourage you to please go ahead and do that. There will be opportunities throughout the webinar today to ask questions. I will pause specifically so that you can do that, but please empower yourselves to also use the chat function. We'll be monitoring that in addition, and that I think takes care of most of the background and technical issues. So here's. I'm sorry, if you hear me pause, it's because we're hearing lots of beeps and buzzing as people join the webinar, and so I'm just trying to stay focused here. So the point of the webinar, if some of you on the line are familiar with the project, have known our work for a long time, and probably some of you are new to the project and just saw the most recent RFP, and we are absolutely delighted by both of those things, both to be joined by longtime colleagues and to make new colleagues. And as we put together, the folks of us here at the project put together the new RFP, we really thought that what would be helpful was maybe doing at least a brief webinar to orient people both to the major emphases of the new funding, this new round of funding, and then also obviously more specifically to help you all think through what can be a vital part of a successful proposal, which is the submission of a logic model. And so again, I'm going to go through a number of different things here, try not to get too technical, hopefully try to keep this as engaging as I can as possible, which is almost an oxymoron for a webinar, but I'm going to do my best, and please again do empower yourselves to ask questions, because we'd love to take advantage of the opportunity of being together on this live call to answer your questions. The people that hear that on the recording won't have that advantage, so we hope that you take advantage of it. First of all, just to sort of get us going along, as you all probably have had some time to look at the new RFP, just a quick review of what the major grant emphases are. We have two categories of funding that we'll be focusing on for the 2015-2017 grant period, the first of which are the WellBeing Seminar grants. This is really intended to be campus gatherings They do have a structure. We do intend them to be formal events. It's not just necessarily gathering your friends and colleagues, but really a chance to kind of dig in on what are some of the key issues and questions that are driving your campus conversation around well-being. And we've actually framed these seminar grants. I would underscore here, have tried to pay attention to these seminar grants as potential opportunities to involve conversations around faculty well-being, in addition to student well-being, in addition to community well-being. We really do see these as kind of a holistic approach to what gets at our institutional missions around well-being. I've added a third bullet point here to highlight for you all, if you're not familiar with some of Bringing Theory to Practice's former work, that we've been doing seminars for a couple of years I would say, not to be too boastful, but to a good level of success. We funded hundreds of campus seminars. They have been tremendously useful tools in generating conversation on campuses. And so that third bullet is to let you know that we have examples of what those seminars have been, mostly related to civic engagement and civic missions on campuses, but nonetheless, might give you some interesting insights into what those seminars look like. And then obviously in direct relation to what we'll be talking most about today is the WellBeing Research project grants. At Bringing Theory to Practice, we have been doing research grants for some time. This has been sort of a mainstay of our campus funding work, and you'll see that this is not a huge amount of money. It does come with institutional matching, but I can tell you, if you are considering one of these grants, as I assume you are if you're listening to the webinar, that we know a bit now over the years about how much campuses can actually do with this amount of money, and we've been tremendously encouraged by it. So we do hope that you will take that seriously, and again, think about what you can be doing to answer some of the research questions you have, but also to do it in a way that's meaningful enough to be sustained beyond the life of the project. And again, just adding another third bullet point there to give you a link to some of the other things that we have on our website around other research projects and grants that people have, folks on campuses have been doing to great levels of success. I'm not necessarily saying that in terms of all the findings working out perfectly, but I am saying in terms of ability to implement and assess and really learn some things. So I will mention here, because I didn't add them on the particular slide, that the Category 1 Wellbeing Seminar Grants have two deadlines. Just to highlight these for you, the first deadline is September 15th, and the second deadline will be January 15th, 2016. And so we have two deadlines for the Category 1 Wellbeing Grants. That's a slightly different format from us. Again, if you're familiar with some of our previous work, we had previously done rolling quarterly deadlines, so we just have the two deadlines this time. And then the Category 2 Wellbeing Research Grants are due August 1st, and there is just one deadline for those. So please do let us know as you're putting your proposals together how we can be of help. We do want everybody who's interested in applying for that grant to be able to do so. We want to help to facilitate that, which is in part why we are here today and focusing on these Category 2 grants. So just as again, a quick review to highlight probably some of the things that you flagged in your own review of the requirements for the Wellbeing Research Grants is just three sort of main areas of what a good proposal needs to have, or what a full proposal, I should at least say, needs to have, is obviously name and contact information. I won't go through all of this, but you will have noticed that in the proposal narrative, we have specifically called out the idea that any successful grant proposal needs to have a clear statement of anticipated outcomes and action steps. We've recommended here, again, a logic model or its equivalent is expected. And the equivalent is really intended to underscore the level of articulation and definition you would need to get to what a logic model does. And so the point of taking you through the bits and pieces of a logic model today is actually to help you, I think, understand, if you're not familiar with these tools, just what that level of articulation looks like. And then obviously how the proposed work will link the research objectives to advancing a core campus strategy. This will actually, I've highlighted this in red because while the mention of a logic model is mentioned in the bullet point above, this bullet point actually gets to the impact statement around logic models. So I wanted to make it clear that this too is actually a part of the logic model that should be there. And then the evaluation, reporting information, and so forth will be there. And then the final part, as always, of course, is the budget, and there are guidelines in the RFP. And certainly if you had any questions, specific questions about budget or structure of the budget, what's appropriate for budget, those would be appropriate follow-up questions following the webinar, and one of our project crew can answer one of those questions for you. So now that we're about 10 minutes in or so, let's get to the good stuff. Well, I guess before I do, let me pause and see if anybody has questions. This is one of a few of these slides. Okay. And if you want to mute your line, go ahead and press *6, and then to unmute is *6 as well. So I'm just pausing for a moment. Okay. All right, we'll continue on here. So why logic models? What's the point of using tools, of integrating them into the work that we do? And this is probably one of my favorite depictions of why logic models can be helpful, at least as I've gotten more involved in program assessment in higher education. And as you all are probably thinking through the idea of well-being on your campuses, obviously a core emphasis, and I apologize for not mentioning this in the previous slide, was that we're actually have a special emphasis this year on this funding period on underserved students, with underrepresented minority, first generation, transfer, and low-income students. So as we think about all of the many pieces of our campus cultures and contexts that are needed to make outcomes work, to make them be effective, to say anything about the outcomes, you begin to think through all the different things that have to be part of that puzzle. So even if we identify the kinds of things, the outcomes that we want, and the assessment that goes into those things, we're often left with a whole jumble of things that go into actually getting some amount with regard to those outcomes. And this gets even trickier, if you can imagine, even trickier when you try to add the co-curriculum, which you should, by the way, in terms of thinking through the kind of learning, obviously support networks, peer support, staff support, faculty support, all sorts of things that are really happening in the co-curriculum to support these efforts. So from my perspective in working with assessment in higher education for the better part of 10 years now, this is the most consistent challenge, is to really organize the things that we do in full service to the things that we want. So logic models can be very helpful in that, but particularly because they provide a means for addressing the kinds of questions that you see on your screen right now. So thinking first about what's the differences in outcomes. One of the first sort of I wouldn't say mistakes, but a missed opportunity for sure when we undertake assessment is just differentiating that outcomes are different. There are short-term outcomes, there are intermediate outcomes, there are long-term outcomes, and all of those things matter, and the articulation of each of those really matters, particularly when you think about the fact that just having a really clear vision for something, a clear vision for change is often the moral imperative that makes us want to do the work in the first place. So without that, you really kind of lose your steam for wanting to pursue the thing in the first place. But everybody knows you can't just assess the vision. So how do you sort of break it down from there? and this is a large challenge with assessment. How do we actually connect the things that we're doing with the outcomes that we're seeking to get? How do we really think through the types of evidence that we need to say something meaningful about those outcomes? And I also like to add in on that one, how much evidence do we need? What's good enough evidence to get the conversation to the next phase, get the project to the next phase? Those are all helpful considerations. And again, I assume almost all of you, if not all of you, are working in mostly resource-scarce environments in one way or another, right? And if you have plenty of money, I can tell you your faculty think their time is scarce, and students think their time is scarce. So there's always one way, at least, that resources aren't there. But logic models really, and I'll show you this in a moment, but really help us to think through a holistic approach to what resources can be beyond just budget lines, beyond just line items, but also thinking about physical resources, infrastructure resources, the kinds of centers that you might have on campus, really allow you to, once you've worked through the whole model, to begin to kind of really ascertain a full look at what resources might actually be at your disposal. So the first, as I mentioned a moment ago, the first consideration with logic models and with thinking through your own programs, and I should mention here that we are doing this webinar very early, and I guess I could have started with that. We don't have the due date for obviously these project answers until August. We've got quite a lot of time to procrastinate. So I think we're tremendously encouraged that there's so many of you on the line today that are at least maybe even beginning to think about what projects might look like. And so I do hope that so the one advantage of going this early in the process is that you have the logic model in mind as you go through all of your conversations, which I do think can be a huge benefit. And one of those starting points is really stopping everything that all the nuts and bolts of whatever program that you're currently have and want to attach to this RFP to get funding for, whatever program you'd like to start or go deeper with and attach to this. I would strongly encourage you and your team to take a step back and ask yourselves, what's the point? What's the whole thing for? And to really think about what is your long-term vision for what this program ought to do. What's your long-term vision for well-being at the institution? How is this connected to your institutional mission? I would absolutely get out your mission statement, your curricular and co-curricular goal statements, your advising statements, any one of a number of things that could really give you some insights into how this language has already been articulated on your campus. And then also think about your intermediate outcomes and then also short-term outcomes at the same time. And hopefully you see this citation on the right-hand side of your screens. A really nice framing for this is from Thomas Grayson's work, and also a good colleague of mine, Hazel Simonette at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has done some great work on logic models too. I'm grateful to both of those colleagues for their good work on this, and I'm totally stealing this framework because I just like it so much. Another framing for long-term, intermediate, and short-term that you will see on lots of literature around logic models is just this kind of simple statements around what would you love to see? What would you absolutely love to see? And then what would you like to see? And then what do you expect to see? And each of those frameworks, in kind of a different way, it's getting at sort of the same thing, but also in a slightly different way, reminds you that you have different levels of expectations, attainable goals, if you will, and different senses of what the ideal can be. And all of those questions are worth asking. And another part of this that's important to remember as you're thinking at the program level is that as you move toward love, maybe this gets a little corny at some point, but as you move toward love, it actually necessarily means you need higher levels of collaboration. And that's because as you move from your own locus of control, usually at the narrow program level, oftentimes, if that's at a course level, if you all are working with courses, for example, or specific service learning courses or well-being courses, it could be anything, that faculty member or the faculty-staff combination will have an immediate locus of control. And in that expect-to-see circle in short-term outcomes, they will have the highest amount of control over those outcomes being affected. But as you tie together programmatic elements and want to tell a story at larger and larger levels of programmatic aggregation across multiple students, for example, across multiple classes and across multiple experiences, that's when you have to start thinking about, well, what are the intermediate outcomes and who do I need to involve in those discussions to think about evidence, and then also long-term outcomes, obviously, to really meet that big vision piece. So there's a nice tie-in when you're really thinking about the disaggregation of outcomes to what are the levels of collaboration that you also need to make this stuff work. So the reason I like that previous slide, I like Hazel and Thomas's representation of the circles is because what you will tend to see when you go and look at other logic model frameworks is basically this slide. You will see a series of boxes. These things are great. You're never without a logic model because you can reproduce one almost instantly on any piece of paper you have. It's just a series of boxes. But I think that first visual helps to kind of take apart these first two boxes on the far right side as we go through here. So the impact goals, for example, and I'm going to start, if you will, to sort of break this down into a finer level of application to the kinds of questions that I guess you all are asking or might be asking. I'm going to try to make it personal here as much as I can. So what is the hope for the future of students? For the faculty, for the institution, again, I highly encourage you to take a look at mission statements, vision statements, wherever you're finding those strategic planning kind of documents, that can be helpful language. And you should also depart from that language if you don't find it inspiring enough. And then the next is what we might call an outcomes box. And this really involves short and intermediate outcomes. But this is really a look at what should improve as a direct result of the activities and the evidence that you gather. And those outcomes should be aligned with the impact statement. There should be some connection there. It's not going to be perfect because obviously goal statements and impact and vision statements tend to be broad and, again, inspirational largely. But that doesn't mean they're wholly disconnected. And so there should be some understood common threads there. The next part of logic models, and I often say this when I'm working with campuses on these models, this is the box that I tend to see missing the most often. And whether we're doing any kind of program design, whether we're looking at general education reform, you name it, it's usually the outputs box that's usually the gaping hole in the plan for assessment and the plan for action. And it's really, and what's troubling about that is it really is the evidence box. It really is that thing that says, what is it that we need to know? What is it that we think is good enough evidence to say something about the outcomes that we care about? So these outputs and outcomes boxes should be closely connected. There shouldn't be an output that doesn't tell you something about one of the outcomes. It doesn't need to tell you everything about all of the outcomes, but it should tell you something about one of them. And again, in the next slide, I'll populate these boxes with examples from campus work, so you can kind of get another look at what we're talking about here. But of course, the outputs have to be driven by something. They have to be generated by something. And that's where the activities come in. As you can imagine, you all are on busy campuses, and you probably do lots and lots in all of your different roles and jobs on that campus. And so usually the activities box is the easiest one for people to fill in. Usually people have a pretty good handle on what it is that they're doing. And I think we tend to be less good at asking, why are we doing all of those things? And what kind of evidence should we be generating from those things? But the activities themselves, we do know something about. if I was going to press you a little further on this activities box, it would be to also, particularly for those of you that are on campuses right now, or you have a project team around you and you have a pretty good idea of the project that you'd like to propose for this RFP, my way to nudge your thinking a little bit deeper on the activities is to ask you, what do you know about the quality of those activities? What do you know about the quality of the implementation of those activities, the degree to which each and every time they're being implemented, they're doing so with a certain degree of fidelity, and to what degree have you articulated what those quality dimensions are? So if you're feeling like you're at an advanced campus, that's a way to nudge you a little bit further. And then the next piece, as I mentioned before, is the resources piece. So that is the idea that we're thinking holistically about resources on campus. It is a rare campus that cannot be doing so, that can't be thinking expansively across your alumni center, your career center, your teaching and learning center, your institutional research office. But there's a key reason why the inputs come last. And that's a reminder that you really need each of the previous 4 boxes to really inform all the resources that you need. And what we do tend to do is start with the resources sometimes and artificially constrain the vision based on resources that we think we have, rather than articulating all the things that we'd liked, all the things we're dreaming about and would like to do, and then figuring out the resources from there. It works a little better that direction. So as promised, here's just a quick population of these. I'm not going to read through all of them. Again, you all will get the slides and you'll have an opportunity to flip through them at a little slower pace. But this is just a way to begin to embed some language that you might resonate with, or might be something that you're talking about on your campus, just to give you an idea of what these boxes might look like. And one of the things that I would mention here is logic models aren't absolute. It's just a tool. It's just a heuristic. It's just a way of beginning to organize ideas. Sometimes I do workshops on logic models, and people will ask, well, we're really puzzling over whether this is an output or an outcome, or if it's an activity or an output, or one box or another. And that is a good generative conversation for you and your project team to have. And they're not absolutes here. But so you should understand that there are gray areas, but those are always good opportunities for conversation across the project team. The outcomes that I've listed here are not by any means to suggest that your work needs to be limited to these. Again, these are all just suggestions and examples of ways to fill in these boxes. I've provided a resource from the University of Pennsylvania's Positive Psychology Center. It has a wonderful resource list on research tools related to positive psychology. I also think that there are other relevant outcomes, for example, whether those are related to civic engagement, whether those are related to learning. Obviously, these are well-being grants, so we would expect some clear articulation of what your campus means by well-being and how you are defining that and assessing that. But I don't mean to suggest that those are the only outcomes you could be interested in. It would make great sense to me if it wasn't limited to that, but just to kind of give you some idea of what could go here. The outputs are things that students do. These are examples of students' direct work that they might be pulling or gaining from experiences that they're involved in. If you're familiar at all with some of the work at AAC&U, we work a lot with students' direct assessment of learning. And so I tend to, when I think of outputs, I tend to think of the things that students produce, and the idea that learning is doing. And if students don't produce something from their learning, it's unlikely they will have learned anything or had an opportunity to at least process that learning. The outputs category, when you begin to think about the kind of evidence that you need, is probably in many ways, and I don't mean this at all ironically or to lose your trust in me, but it is probably the most exciting one here. I love being in workshops and listening to faculty and staff, really smart people who are good at what they do, start to generate ideas for how to elicit evidence from students about their learning, their civic engagement, their well-being, you name it. But this is, again, the box to really think about what is the evidence you need. You could also, for example, be putting in surveys here. I don't mean to discount those. They are indirect evidence of student learning and perception. They can be vital. They are, in all honesty, they are almost the only tools we really have for assessing students' well-being or indications of that, so I do understand that. But again, those outputs should be clearly connected with the outcomes that they're linked to. So, for example, many of you are probably using the National Survey of Student Engagement on your campuses. I would strongly encourage you to use those data as well as you can and to use the administration of that survey as well as you can. But if you link it to flourishing, because flourishing is an outcome, that's impossible because the NSE survey doesn't ask anything about student flourishing. So that's what I mean in terms of actually making sure that the instruments you're using connect with the outcomes that you seek, and being intentional about that. Okay. The activities can be a whole range of things. Again, I think this is probably one of the easier categories for you to fill in. It is, again, a great opportunity as you're mapping out your program or your courses or whatever it is that your intervention, if you will, is dealing with, to really kind of pull apart what are you really doing in this thing that you feel like is different than things that other students are doing. You know, what's the special element of what's happening here? What is it that makes this particular experience unique? And there is an opportunity, again, to kind of to really articulate that. And then here's my example of how you begin to think holistically across the kinds of resources that you have. And if you are noticing things in this slide that point to, for example, general education, that point to a kind of systemic nod, that is because at Bringing Theory to Practice, we've always been most interested in the fact that grants continue beyond the grant life. That is, that the work continues beyond the life of the grant, and that things aren't done simply to do an experiment and leave it behind. We always hope that campuses are looking towards their mission statement and trying to do things that they're interested in because they really want to make these sustainable parts of campus life and culture. So when I include things like Gen Ed, and when I include things like the Counseling Center, Teaching and Learning Center, it really is to nudge your thinking towards what are the kinds of systemic resources that you have that can be built upon and oriented towards a kind of ongoing effort. Okay, let me pause there and see if people have more questions. And I think there's, okay. So we have one question that came up that is, could international students be considered underserved as well as first generation low-income students or underrepresented minority students? It's a great question. And here's my response to that is we have, you will see in the RFP a caveat of traditionally underserved to point to the idea that these are students that we define these categories, low income, first generation, so forth, as being traditionally at risk and underserved by higher education. However, what we would expect if you vary from that list as the understood list of what counts as underserved, and I'm also drawing from my work with my colleague at AAC&U, Tia McNair, our Senior Director of Student Success, and we've done lots of work on high impact practices and underserved students. And one of the things that we do say to campuses quite often when we present that work is we don't presume to know who's underserved on your campus. That could be veterans, that could be LGBT students, that could be underrepresented religious groups on your campus. So I really appreciate this question because it allows me to say just that. While we have a traditionally defined category or categories of underserved students, we won't presume to know who's underserved on your campus, but we would expect you to justify how and why those students are underserved. That could be with some evidence indicating that they are at risk, indicating that they are less likely to seek or be able to take advantage of particular opportunities on your campus. we would definitely expect to see some rationale and evidence for why those students are underserved. But it's a fabulous question, and one that we would definitely entertain with you. So another question came in: can you submit a proposal for a new program that has not been implemented yet? Yes, absolutely. The caveat with that is that we don't assume that the first year of the grant will be a planning period. We don't assume that there will be a planning year and then in year 2 the program gets up and running. So if in fact if a proposal came in like that, we would probably decline and say it would have been better if you could come back with something where you could kind of hit the ground running. Because of the emphasis on assessment in these project grants, the question will be, can you get it moving right away? Or is it at a phase of implementation where it's really ready to go? And can you collect, or will you be in a position to collect evidence? It won't be obviously definitive evidence. It will be at whatever stage you're at in the collection process. But yes. So I would say definitely go with a new program, but got to be ready to go. Got to be showtime. Great question though. So we'll have another opportunity to ask questions as we move along, just for the sake of keeping us moving along here. Just a few basic principles of logic models. If you get interested in these, and I have lots of resources at the end of this to give you some articles you can read. There's just a kind of a few points of both the helpfulness of the tool. Obviously, you can tell that I believe in them. I like the organization. I like how they make us break down our ideas. But I also really like that they place a large emphasis on collaboration. They're meant to be formed and constructed collaboratively. It's because each and every one of those boxes is informed by a viewpoint. And if you just bring your viewpoint or those of your close colleagues who you only ever talk to on campus, your plan won't be nearly as holistic or nearly as bothered as it should be. We really ought to agitate these plans in ways that we're consistently asking ourselves, will this really work? And as many diverse viewpoints as you can bring into that conversation will benefit you. They are intended to make us articulate our ideas and make sense of why we think things work the way they do, so that not only can we do that for ourselves and do that for a simplified assessment plan, but also so we can use them as communication tools. A number of projects that we've developed at ACNU, and also in working with campuses at BTtoP, we have created logic models simply for the utility of being able to talk across our project teams. Having some very simple resource that we could always come back to and say, where are we at on the logic model? Have we done this piece? Did this piece go well? What do we need to do now that have year 1 done and we need to move forward? So they're a tool that once created can always be changed and should be adapted and morphed to fit your needs and the maturation of the project, but they can be a fantastic foundational resource for continuing the conversation, make sure everybody's on the same page. And also bringing it to new audiences too. It's a great way to kind of unfold that when you need to talk to your provost about what you're doing. I just mentioned they're attentive to the maturation of projects over time. That is to say that the impact statement, the outcomes, each and every one of those boxes can get honed the degree to which you're implementing your program, for example. So the difference between campuses that will be taking programs already up and running and the difference between ones that are at an early phase of implementation, there's always a growth period for any of those, but that growth period might happen in different places. The advanced campuses might have the activities pretty well down, all the bugs have been worked out, and now they're really thinking through outputs and really thinking through the outcomes. And vice versa. It might be that early implementers might be still kind of working through the logistics of getting the activities perfectly implemented with perfectly. I hope all of you are laughing right now. That never happens on campus. But implemented enough so you have a certain level of fidelity to quality and so forth. But maturation does happen with projects. I like logic models because they remind us of that. I mentioned a moment ago why you start with outcomes and not inputs. That is both because you need to define where you're going and also so you don't constrain the vision in trying to get there. So there's a reason that the outcomes come first, but there's also a really killer reason that the inputs come last. And to try to keep you coming back to the resources that you have that serve that vision. I didn't mention this, and I always forget to mention this, so this is why I made myself put it in this slide. If you read enough about logic models, you will see that there's often an arrow underneath every single one of the boxes. It rides the whole length of the logic model, and it's an assumptions bar. And it is to remind us that on each and every one of those boxes, from the vision plan to the resources, we all and always, almost always, make assumptions about what we have and what we don't have. So those could be assumptions about faculty engagement. Those could be assumptions about the clarity of your mission. That could be assumptions about the degree to which anybody actually gets what you're doing and agrees with it. Those could be assumptions about leadership and the support of leadership. Those could be assumptions about institutional matching funds. At each and every one of those boxes, it is important for your team to also take space in your time of creating your proposal to talk about the assumptions and talk about how those play out. They're not, acknowledging assumptions isn't intended to derail your efforts, by the way. It's simply meant to inform what you're doing and give some honesty to your ability to reach those things or to confront those things. Here's, as I mentioned, a whole bunch of resources. I mentioned Thomas Grayson's work. I included a relatively short chapter. I included this one too because I know I can get you a PDF of it. So let me know if that would be helpful. And then this third bullet is just my favorite resource for logic models ever. It's totally free online. It's really where I started with my work on these, and it's just tremendously helpful. It's a great starting point if you want to learn more. We don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to go through this example relatively quickly because it's highly text heavy. And I intended that because I'm actually going to put all this up here. This is from colleagues at Dartmouth who gave me permission to use this in some of my presentations on logic models. I worked with Dartmouth a little bit. They've worked with bringing theory to practice. And from a previous conversation about logic models, they got interested in taking their program language that they had already developed around their program and translating that into a logic model. So what I'm about to show you is really mostly the work that they have done, not necessarily the work that I have done, but what I've done here is basically cut and paste exactly from their project proposal, if you will, telling us about the Mentoring with Purpose program. And I like this, and I like coming back to these because I think it's very honest in the kind of language that we tend to use as we describe our programs, whether those are in external communications or internal communications. This looked like language I tend to see from campuses, which is great. But the next phase is how do you break this down and actually put it into a logic model. So you see this is a pretty comprehensive Mentoring with Purpose program intended to connect students to what they call cascade mentoring. Basically, students get mentored and then they develop mentoring skills and are able to mentor others. A neat idea that's very, sort of multifaceted. One of the things that I tend to do when I get this kind of language from campuses and start to work with them on developing logic models is start to just sort of flag things, just begin to tag. Where do I see bits and pieces of what could be an impact statement? Where do I see outcomes happening? What look like the activities? What look like the things that this is what makes the program go? Where do I see elements and bits and pieces of resources? So these are just ways, again, they're not absolute. They're not concrete. It doesn't mean I'm right, but it's a way to begin to break down the language and section it off so you can put it into different places. And the language itself might not flow in a perfect order, by the way. So that's why you see little bits and pieces, maybe an impact statement later on, and activities could be embedded, but it's a way to begin to carve up the language. So if we begin to sort of plug this in, take that example, begin to plug it into the whole model, we might get something like this. We might begin to get a notion of what the long-term vision looks like. Remember, a long-term vision should be really hard to assess. You would need years and years and years of data and then a lot of inference to sort of get to the big vision statement. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. It should be inspiring. And then closer, where do we begin to see outcomes that look a little closer to home, things we could assess within 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, intermediate outcomes. even 3 years, but definitely you're going to take a certain amount of data. And then what are the short-term outcomes? What are the things that it seems like we could do this year, even within a semester? How hard, what evidence would we need to say, for example, that we've engaged students as allies? That's a relatively short-term kind of thing that you can do, but it's worth separating that out from the other pieces. And then, again, to reinforce this notion around collaboration, the idea that people need to be involved as you're moving along the continuum. So it's an opportunity as the program matures and develops over time that who would you need to pull into the conversation as you go along, or who might you need to be involved more intentionally as the plan moves along? So you're going to see a lot. So I apologize again for this in advance. You're going to see a lot of text in these boxes, but I'm really pulling from most of the things that colleagues at Dartmouth did in translating their overall program into a logic model. So again, this is mostly their work, not mine. And I gave them feedback on this and such, but it's, again, a chance to kind of an actual campus plan in action from the kind of language they're using. And I'll highlight one piece. I know you're probably scanning through this, and again, you'll have more time to kind of think through each piece of it. You'll notice, too, maybe a few things just to pull out. So they have lots of different things happening in the impact goals. So something to read through there. One thing that's not there, of course, is the full connection to the mission, for example. So that could be there. The outcomes are actually separated for students and faculty and staff. So there's something to consider, for example, there in how our faculty and staff being engaged in this process, and how might a separate logic model be created for their outcomes. You'll notice that the output definitely involves survey data. So that's something to consider as well. A good list of activities that probably look like many of the things that you might be considering on your campus and how those fit in. And then a whole lot of different kinds of inputs that are quite idiosyncratic to this particular campus, but those are ways for you to think through what you might have as well. So lots of text there, but that's definitely something you could flip through as you go back through these slides later. And the last thing I want to do, if you're all filled up and you've totally had enough of logic models, wait, there's more. You could actually create multiple logic models for the same program. Now, I hasten to add, we are not requiring these for your program, for your project proposals. We really just want to see the student level work and see how students are going to be affected by the work. You won't necessarily get bonus points if you do the other one. But I do also just wanted to suggest that if I've learned anything from my work with campuses over this many years, it's that really when we talk about student level outcomes, we are almost always talking about some change in faculty outcomes and staff outcomes at the same time. And institutional outcomes are certainly hovering in the distance, whether those are retention, graduation, student success indicators, you name it. So as you dig into this, and if you have a project team that is really liking this process and really wanting to think through all parts, and you're thinking that there might be something going on with faculty level outcomes, for example, it might be worth articulating those. And so this is just a breakdown of how you might begin to think about those things and put those into place. So let me. Okay, so I'm going to pause for just a second because a question came in on just this exact topic. And thanks again for the team over here flagging these for me. I'm having trouble talking and watching chat at the same time. So the question is, I'm considering a proposal focusing on faculty's contributions to student well-being. So the focus could be on faculty actions supporting such things as students in distress or beliefs about learning capacities. Is this focus on faculty okay? That's interesting. And I would like the idea that, particularly if we're talking about underserved students' well-being for this, and we think in many ways we are talking about faculty's contributions to well-being. and the faculty activities connected with that. And so I guess I would say I do think it's okay. I think it's great, actually. But you would still need some articulation of what the change in student well-being will be, and there may be precursors related to faculty development. And so that is a question for you in terms of where that faculty development occurs, and probably encouraging you to do that faculty development ahead of the actual intervention, and then make the intervention itself part of what you're doing with students. We do know that a lot of this work involves faculty development, and that too is part of what drives that focus on faculty outcomes. But I am coming back to the language of the RFP that really does focus on student well-being outcomes. The seminar grants are related to those. So if you really wanted to start with the faculty piece of it, it might be worth considering a seminar grant first to focus on that. That's a bit of an answer at this stage, and I'm certainly happy to follow up on that offline and have a fuller conversation about that, but that's a quick reaction. And I was going to pause there for questions. So are there any additional questions? We're almost done, and our time's almost up anyway. So, okay. Let me just show you one last, and these are really some final parting questions to, as you start working with your team and working through what you might be interested in doing. Here are just some haunting kind of questions to guide your work as you move along. Apologize for missing a question mark on this, but so early questions, for example, of the degree to which you've articulated different levels of outcomes, thinking through that. What are you actually asking students to do? What are the changes in faculty that you might be interested in? What are the changes at the institutional level that you might be interested in? How do you want to connect those, again, to changes in faculty well-being? But intentionality at each of those levels is really key for successful programs. What do you actually want students to be doing that will produce evidence? And again, that can be surveys, that could be some kind of intake, whether that's a flourishing scale or a life satisfaction scale, a self-esteem scale. That could be a number of things, but students really ought to have been nudged to have had some amount of reflection on the experience, some opportunity to dialogue about it, to have a conversation about it, and the same with faculty and staff. And I apologize for missing staff in this particular slide, but definitely staff are very much at play in what we're talking about. And then certainly too, what resources exist that will contribute to your overall goals. How are you thinking through those? How are you relying on your project team to inform those conversations? That would be helpful pieces. And so just as a quick addendum, I wanted to point to a couple of things. A couple of these resources you saw earlier in the presentation, so I've just put them together here. Again, the Kellogg Foundation Guide to Logic Models. We have a Bringing Theory to Practice Toolkit instrument, which is basically an assembling of standardized instruments from a number of different sources. There's a user's guide that goes with that will tell you where all of the instruments, all the individual instruments come from. It also includes a copy of the flourishing scale. So if you want to see the flourishing scale, that is attached to the toolkit instrument. I've already noted UPenn's Positive Psychology Center, an excellent resource. AAC and U-Value rubrics, some of you I know are probably using those on your campus already. There are no rubrics related to well-being. I would be delighted to have a conversation if anybody's interested in what that might look like in developing one. I can tell you there are campuses that have them. Tidewater Community College, in fact, has a personal development rubric that they use on their campus. That's terrific. But some of these that might be interested to actually get you thinking about direct assessment. And if you're not familiar with the Wabash Center for Inquiry in the Liberal Arts, they have a number of good tools and instruments on their website to use. So these are mostly resources for assessment tools that you can look into. And then just as a final closing in the last about five minutes here, but these are just places to direct any of your follow-up questions. So anything about logistics of how the grants should be submitted, components, questions about the budget, direct and indirect costs, all sorts of fun stuff like that. Those can absolutely be directed to info@bttop.org, and there's an actual human being that will check that from time to time and make sure that we stay on top of that. And then obviously any questions that you have about the webinar and the bits and pieces of logic models or your own individual questions about project assessment that have already come up here, and I only got a chance to respond to a little bit and maybe could respond to in greater length, I'm happy to do that. Just shoot me a note anytime, and I'm happy to correspond with you about that. So that's a lot of me talking. Any final questions before we end here? Okay, all right, we'll stop there then. I want to wish all of you best of luck and best wishes for a successful end to the semester, and thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. We appreciate it, and we look forward to reading your proposals.